the IMF has what they call Article 4 consultation. And that's coming up in China, which is due to come up this month sometime, maybe next month. Probably China will postpone it for a little while. It'll take a lot of preparation and so on. But we're going to hear a lot about these things going on in the future, because of what to do. China has, of course, its own policy, but China's got a surplus now of 200 billion. But is exchange rate change the right mechanism? Japan had a surplus in the 1980s. In fact, from 1980 until the present, in every year, Japan has had a big surplus. Usually over $100 billion, sometimes over $150 billion. Right now, the surplus of Japan is $150 billion. Was exchange rate the remedy for Japan? Under the exchange rate bashing, that was what the directive for Japan to appreciate their currency. Well, they did, because in 1985, the G5 got together at the Plaza Accord to pressure, well, the U.S. was saying all the other countries have to appreciate the currency, but essentially it was mainly applied to Japan. And the Japanese currency in the next 10 years tripled in value against the U.S. dollar. At the time of the Plaza Accord, the dollar was 239 yen. This is September 22nd, say 1985. The dollar was 239 yen. 10 years later, in April of 1995, the dollar had dropped to a low point of 78 yen. From more or less 240 to 280. See, the dollar went to 1/3 against the yen. The yen tripled in value against the dollar. 300% appreciation. What happened to trade balances? The balance today of Japan is bigger than it was then. And that's a colossal change in trade balances. What it did, it created a tremendous deflation in Japan. It created 15 years of stagnation and deflation. I was in Japan in March, and I read in the newspaper, it just happened to read in the newspaper, that a historic point has been reached in Japan, because for the first time since 1990, real estate prices had stopped falling. In other words, from 1990 to the present, that's 17 years, real estate prices have been falling in Japan, all because of the hangover from that big appreciation of the currency. You know, for a long time, the historic post-war exchange rate between the dollar and the yen was 360 yen to the dollar. That was from 1948 until 1971, 360. And now the yen, the dollar has been now is not at the low point of 80 yen, 78 yen, but it's been around 115, 120, and this morning it's 109. So we have that tripling of the yen against the dollar over that period, with deflation and everything else that goes into it. Well, 3 revolutions in the 1970s, the divorce of money from gold. Gold is no longer part of the international system. Managed flexible exchange rates, and then the Second Amendment to the IMF article. I make some criticisms of change that I've heard them mostly. This is a picture of the dollar against the euro and the dollar against the yen. Actually, it's the exchange rate on 100 yen. The blue line is 100 yen. Now, let's just look at this. Because this is the world we're living in now. This is the world we have to live in now. The dollar against the yen. And the dollar cycle. Up, down, up, down, up. This is the euro. This is the euro one. So up for the euro means down for the dollar. up in the up for the euro means down for the dollar, falling dollar in the 1970s, rising dollar under the Reaganomics supply side revolution, tax cuts and tight money to stop the inflation. And then the plasma accord up here to get the dollar down and the euro up, and the euro stayed up. Then you have here around 1990, you have here the high point here where the dollar reaches high for the. Now this is not the. You can think of this as the euro, but it's the ECU before the euro. The euro didn't come into existence until 1999, but this is the European currency unit before, because the euro was based on the basket of the European currency. So this is the, and then you had the kind of European crisis where the Deutsche Mark went way up, and then you had this movement way down, and where the euro goes way down. This is the great expansion of the 1990s of the dollar. The dollar was soaring. The Silicon Valley IT revolution came in. The U.S. growth rate was doubling in the last half of the 1990s. The dollar was soaring over this period. And that was the period of the Asian crisis, which everybody in this audience, well, you wouldn't remember it, but you might have been too young to really remember, but you know it from the history of the period. And the Asian crisis, no doubt about it, was caused by the instability of exchange rates. Not the stability, but the instability, although there is this element of stability there. The instability of the exchange rate, because here it's now a question of this is the yen. This is the yen, this is the price of the yen. Now the yen is a high point up here. And then the yen falls over here. This is exactly the period, this fall in the value of the yen. From the dollar went from, say, 80 yen in 95 up to 148 yen in June 1998. So in those 3 years, this is the period when the most important currency, the blue line is the most important currency for Asia, the exchange rate of Asia. The dollar-yen exchange rate is the most important. And this was the period when the yen plummeted. The dollar soared to 148 yen. And what happens when the yen goes down like this, it dried up completely all Japanese investment to Southeast Asia. And Japanese investment had been in FDI into Southeast Asia was the spark plug for the South Asian growth of this period. And this all dried up. And then the Asian currencies were tied more or less to the dollar, which was now soaring and appreciating, and they all had to get off the dollar, and that was the thing. But all that investment, Japanese plants in Thailand were just left. I don't know if they've come back. Now, Fujitsu, some of the big plants, I don't know if they've come back and so on. But what the typical thing that the Japanese plants did, they left Southeast Asia, and then they came back to China. They moved into China at that point. They decided that China is the market that they needed to be in more, and this was the main thing. So it was the instability of the major currencies that created the Asian crisis. That was the external causes. And then, of course, the Asian countries didn't have a very smooth way of getting on their overvalued currencies, because they had to act, to the extent they were fixed, they had to appreciate with the US dollar over that period. The dollar was too strong. Every country China was fixed to the dollar too. But China was okay because in 1994, China had devalued against the dollar. The dollar in 1993 was 5.5 RMB. And in January 1, 1994, China had this whopping devaluation to put the dollar up to initially 8.7 and then 8.3 against the dollar. And it stayed that way. So that 60% or 40% appreciation of the dollar, depreciation of the yen, protected China so it could weather the Asian crisis. quite handily. And although people thought that because all the Asian currencies were going down, China would have to depreciate too, but the Prime Minister, came out and said there will be no change in the Chinese exchange rate for the foreseeable future. And everybody believed it. And when they did, Japanese investment, meanwhile, before had been possibly expecting the risk of a devaluation, stayed out of China too. But as soon as he said that, all the Japanese investment came into China, and the unofficial exchange rate came back down to normal, and and China was in great shape, and that set China off onto this the great, glorious path it was. And it kept that exchange rate through thick and thin. But when the dollar was strengthening, very strong during the Asian crisis and after 1988, 99, China and every single country that was fixed to the dollar had some deflation. Prices were going down. That was you ask, why did suddenly, what did China have in common with Kuwait and the Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Panama? Yet they were all fixed to the dollar. And they all had deflation over that period. A little bit. We're talking minus 1%, less than 1% of the inflation. Just a tiny little bit of, in Hong Kong, of course, too. Hong Kong had a bigger problem because of the turnover to China. So this is anyway. So we learned a lot from these exchange rates, but we want to get to. Should the world have 1 million currencies? Well, why not? Let's see. How do you decide how many currencies there should be? Somebody asked me what I thought the optimum number of currencies should be. In a flippant note, I said, well, it should be like God. It should be an odd number, preferably less than 3. But how many should, well, from a transaction standpoint, it would be great if every country could use the same currency or could relate their currency to a common currency. Then you have a single market in prices. Just as an example I took of this world, this classroom, this auditorium being the world, and people transacting. If you had 10 products to exchange with one currency, you have 10 prices. But if you have 10 currencies, you've got 1,000 prices. It goes up to the square of the number of currencies. So it's very inefficient. That's the cost of additional currencies. What is the optimum number of currencies? From the standpoint of communication, a single language would be the most efficient. Before the Tower of Babel, the mythical Tower of Babel, a single language is the best. If everybody spoke the same language, they couldn't communicate better. And you don't need, whenever you have different languages, you need specialists who are translators and interpreters and things of that nature, and that's always, well, of course, languages are different, and some languages are good, better than others, and et cetera, but from the standpoint of communication, a single language, in exactly the same way, language is a medium of expression, and currencies are a medium of exchange. They're both mediums. They both serve units of account. The unit of account, Keynes once said, he began his book, the great book, the Treatise on Money, not the general theory, but he began his 2-volume work on money, Treatise on Money. The unit of account property of money is the most important property of money. And so that was unit of account property. How many units are needed? And then that depends. Then that's the quotation from John Stuart Mill. It says the case for a world money has been made many times in history. In the ancient world, the talent was a common medium of exchange. And if you can see the talent, what was the talent? The talent was a weight, but it was also a value. And the talent as a weight was a common weight used throughout much of the world, it was the weight that a man, usually maybe a slave, could carry. So if you ask what's the weight, how much is the talent today, people would say 50 pounds, 60 pounds is what they would say. You see the talent, nobody calls it that, in airlines today. There's a rule for many airlines, have common lines, no bag, none of your bags can be more than 70 pounds, I think it is. There's a rule when you send books or something by postal thing. No bag can weigh more than 70 pounds. I was getting into trouble because my bags, when I travel, always are more than that. But so it creates a little problem. But that's and then the money started. What was the talent of money? Talent became a money. Well, a talent of money became the amount of gold that would be the equivalent of about a pound weight in terms of like copper or something like that. So a pound, a talent in money was something like 130 grains. And this is like 15 grains to a gram. So you can see that this is a very tiny amount. But what people did when they didn't understand this, they would calculate the amount of something in the ancient world would say so many talents of gold, and it was a huge number, more gold than would be in existence. But it wasn't that amount. The weight was never 70 pounds or 60 pounds of gold. It was the 60 pounds of, say, copper that would have the equivalent of that in gold, which is what gold is the money. Well, there was an Italian book that the 16th century advocated a global money, actually for Europe, common money for Europe, called Two Lights, people know. And then there were congresses in the 19th century advocating a world currency, advocating a common unit of a common coin that could be used all over the world. And the basic, most popular idea was to take 25 francs or 1 pound, which is about the same, and $5, and adjust them so they're all the same. But Britain said no to it. Britain said, the French and the Americans wanted this, but Britain said no because the pound was the closest thing to a global money. When the pound was already the most widely used global money, then the British didn't want to have rivals for it. In exactly the same way, the United States, maybe the United States, and in the future period, maybe Europe would be the two most strongest opponents of global money. Well, this is the preference of superpowers, unilateralism, and so on. Let me go on a little bit. Monetary independence and possibly a reserve currency, the power configuration of nations. There's the world in 1913. The United States, the dollar, the U.S. area, GDP is bigger than the British Empire area, bigger than the other countries. But Britain is the center of the monetary system. Then we go through. Then the gold standard, when it was reformed in 1928, there's no doubt that the United States was the center of that gold standard, because the United States had stayed on gold all through the war period. The other countries had gone off it. The British Empire is losing significance. The pound has gone down. But this is the power configuration. Then the rise of the U.S. as superpower. This is the configuration as you look at before the euro. And you see the European countries here. Germany, the white area, has it's the third largest currency area in the world, but it's not a really big one. But when the euro created, this becomes now another 110-pound gorilla. That is a big thing. Then the rise of China. If China grows, it'll expand and become more important than Japan some point, and possibility people talk about is an Asian currency area, which would combine the major countries with or without two different models, whether that would include India or not. India hasn't shown much interest in kind of East Asian currency standards, but it might in the future. But an Asian currency area would be a possibility, theoretically, but it's politically unlikely because it's very unlikely that you could get Japan and Japan and China into the same common currency framework. There's no way I could see that Japan and China could be part of a single currency area. They wouldn't give up their currencies because you couldn't have had the euro until you had this complete rapprochement between Germany and France, the old historic enemies for 200 years. They've been big enemies, and you'd have to have that something equivalent to that in Asia for that to exist. But what you could have, of course, is a kind of area that would be linked to the dollar. If the dollar were part of it, then the dollar could still be the anchor for that currency, common currency area, and that would be a possibility in the APEC meeting. I made that suggestion at the Shanghai APEC meeting, but it's not. Of course, this would leave Europe out. But Europe now, there's even a possibility that Europe and the United States might stabilize the dollar-euro rate. This would be a wonderful thing for the world economy if the dollar-euro rate was stable. A little bit like in the 19th century, stabilizing gold price and the gold and silver. If you unite two blocks, two of the biggest blocks, and that would be a big step. Or go beyond it, add Asia, and great case could be made for a global currency. I've made that. I made my first case for that to the U.S. Congress in 1968. 40 years ago. This before the international monetary system broke up. It would have been a lot easier then than it is now. And the end of major currency gyrations, a big advantage for it. There'd be an anchor for national currency. Suppose a country today, suppose Thailand today, it wants a fixed exchange rate. Forget what the paper says, which is nonsense. The fixed currency system is forget what that is. Let's suppose you want. Many countries have fixed exchange rates. And the way you do it is you fix the exchange rate and let that currency use that anchor for your monetary policy. And then instead of, let's say, Thailand has the Thai output is say 1% of the world economy. 1% of the world economy. The dollar area, let's suppose the dollar area is stable. You don't have to worry about inflation in the United States. It's 2.5% in the United States. You don't have to worry about inflation. Now, let's suppose you don't. Then, if you fix to that dollar area, you're going to get the inflation rate in the long run of the United States. So that's the basic argument for it. But if you do it, you give up independent monetary policy. You have no independence in monetary policy. You just do what Hong Kong does. And what Hong Kong has done since 1983. It doesn't even have a central bank to do it. Commercial banks do intervening. They keep the dollar fixed in terms of the Hong Kong dollar. And there's no independent monetary policy. And because there's no independent monetary policy, there are no politicians who can interfere with the adjustment mechanism, and Hong Kong accepts whatever the outcome is in terms of the inflation rate. But it's always about a little bit higher or a little lower than the inflation rate of the United States. Because the United States has been stable, the most stable currency in the 200 years, in the last 200 years, then this is not a bad deal. So it's the word anchor. Now that's the dollar. But now I just put that chart on the board of the exchange rates, which shows that the dollar goes through these cycles. And every time it goes through the cycle, the countries that are fixed to the dollar have a little bit of difficulty. If the dollar goes up and it becomes strong, as in the late 1990s, countries may have a little less inflation or more deflation than they want. And if the dollar goes down, they get a little bit more inflation. China right now, even though it's just appreciating by 5% against the US dollar, has a little bit more inflation. Even under fixed rates, when China had its fixed rate from 94 to, or let's say from 97 to 2005, when the dollar went up in the late 90s, it had a little deflation. When the dollar went down in 2003 and 4, the inflation rate went up to over 4% one year, a little higher than China wanted. But that's not too bad. However, if we could get, instead of the dollar, another anchor for countries like Thailand, another anchor, let's suppose that the Asian currency solution is not going to work. If you could get another anchor, if it was the dollar plus the euro plus the yen, and maybe plus the Chinese RMB, even though the RMB is inconvertible, it's not a convertible currency. So that's an argument against the RMB, but it's because the RMB is expected to rise, you could probably use it still. You could take those four currencies, you could even add the pound sterling if you wanted, and take a basket of those and make that the global anchor and build a global monetary system on that basis. After all, in the 19th century they had gold. We don't need to use gold anymore. We can have enough intelligence to create our own. And as long as that system would work, as long as there was no big global war. Of course, if there's a big war, all bets are off. Heaven forbid that we would have one, but no system, no monetary system has ever been in history or ever will be war-proof if there's the nations involved in this getting into a war. I think that it's an optimistic view, but you should go with that view, and that would be a way to do it. There's different approaches to it, different stages of reform. You could have a basket, which is modifying the I. Every country would have a share in it. I call it the global currency is the INTOR. The world map would be something like that. And every country would be inside that. And that would be
Thank you very much, Mr. Mundell. I'm wondering if the audience can have some questions. Do you have time?
Sure.
Okay.
Robert, I admire you for your courage of advocating something very futuristic and idealistic. And I do see that you try to argue against every possible alternatives that people may put against what you say. But basically, the issue is more than the ideal one world currency regime that you're looking for. The issue of transitional period, which is going to be a long transition. And therefore, countries, particularly like Thailand, which is small, would we be just a little offshoot of, say, if US is our anchor, then we would be a country with no self-determination at all. We'll be moving along with the whims of the prudence of politicians in US or central banker, hopefully wise central banker over there. So that's the issue. The issue is self-determination in a less than ideal world, in a world where you cannot trust whether there will be wisdom that comes from US. And the globalization that is happening around the world have experienced some of those difficulties, that they could not move themselves out from their local difficulties during that period when US is moving up and down. And US does experience some volatility. It's not that stable as we hope it to be. And therefore, I think the issue of transitional self-determination and not allowing discretionary policy that come from someone elsewhere would be a major issue. Your language analogy and metaphor is a good one. Obviously, the language you move to one language will be very efficient in communication around the world, but the dominant language at the stage where you're moving there would have the advantage. You have the cost of transitioning to a new language. You'll be learning other languages, and therefore, dominant economy in that metaphor would have the tremendous advantage over small country like Thailand. That's one very important issue. Then the issue of gradualism. If you have fixed exchange rate regime in the world where there is no flexibility of movement of capital, of labor, of goods and services, then you have a lot of hiccup along the way. Once in a while you have a huge devaluation or otherwise, would it be better in a world where it's less than ideal with no free movement of all factors of production and goods and services to allow some kind of flexibility so that you could gradually adjust rather than an adjustment once in a while with a punctuated period? So I'm wondering if the issue therefore is surrounding this idealism and the movement towards it. I do agree with you in the world of one world architectural currency, it would be a very efficient one. But how do we deal with it in the transition period? It's a long transition. I don't know, 100 years from now, possibly. A small country needs to have some self-determination. Thank you.
Let me mention something that occurred 30-some years ago. Back in 1969, I wrote the first plan for a European currency. First a paper called The Case for a European Currency, and then a plan for a European currency. And as a result of this, the European Commission was thinking in terms of, at that time, of a kind of future monetary union for Europe. And so they asked me to go over in the summer of 1970 to consult with them and make some plans and talk about different things. And I did that. And as I was leaving, one of the visiting politicians, his name is Raymond Barre, he's the later Prime Minister of France, but he asked me, tell us, Professor Mundell, if supposing all political considerations were concluded in this, everybody wanted this idea of the European currency, how long would it take to make it? And I said, well, if you have all the political agreement on it, it would still take longer than some time. Because there are some technical things you have to decide on, some decisions you have to make and so on. And so I would say that it would take at least 3 weeks. That's July 1970. Now you know it took not 3 years, 3 months, 3 years, 3 decades. It was 1999 before they got it. Of course, the reason it took so long is twofold. First of all, at that time, in 1969, there already was a global system. Thailand and all the countries of the world were all had fixed exchange rates. And there was a kind of system that worked very well. The Thai government had no problem with the exchange rates. There was stability. There was no dollar cycle. There was everything was in equilibrium. There was only one problem with the system, and that was the underpricing of the gold price. Gold was out of line. Gold was misaligned, and there was no political way. The Americans didn't want to change the price of gold, and so that's why it broke up. But so there was a lack. Now then, 2 years, a year later, the system broke up, and then all currencies were floating, and the European countries, back under the fixed rates, had the same interest rates. They had the same inflation rates. Their economies were all aligned under the fixed exchange rate system. And it would have been easy, 3 weeks at most, to make the common currency, because you have to design it, you have to do things like that. But all easy to set the basis for that currency. And then the other thing, the reason why it took 30 years, was that the political agreement hadn't been made yet. A lot of people didn't like the idea of that common currency. France wanted to lead the system, and France didn't want to acknowledge the fact that the German economy had become a bigger economy than the French economy, the Deutsche Mark was more important than the franc and so on. And it was only in the 1980s that issue was got. But how long would it take? Well, let's put it this way. Suppose you take now, you get Mr. Bush, President Bush, you get Mr. Blair. Let's suppose Blair is chosen as Mr. Sarkozy wants him to be as the President of Europe, as the representative of Europe. And the Minister of Japan, you get them together and decide, yes, let's have a common currency. You make a basket of those three areas to start with. You could also get President Hu of China and make a basket of four. You could get those currencies. You make the basket, and then you decide to fix to that. Now, the Thai government, the Central Bank of Thailand now, is intervening in the foreign exchange market. It's intervening to prevent the dollar from depreciating too much against the Thai, to prevent the dollar from going down too much. They don't want Thai to increase. So they're already intervening in the foreign exchange market. Let's suppose they go ahead and they decide, well, let's fix the Thai currency. The baht has increased by, what, 15%, 20% in the last year, the last half year. It's increased by a lot. Let's suppose they say a 20% appreciation against the dollar is enough. So let's fix the baht to the dollar. And better still, to insulate against the dollar, let's make it this new basket of the three currencies. So you won't have the big dollar cycle involved in it. What would be the problem with it? You'd then end up with an inflation rate. You wouldn't have the problem of the dollar cycle. You'd have the best monetary policy that you've had since Bretton Woods period of back in the 1970s, in the 1960s, when Thailand had an excellent monetary policy. You'd get back to that. And every year I have a conference at my place in Siena, Italy, in Tuscany. Domingo Cavallo, who is the man who set up the convertibility system for 10 years in Argentina, comes to this all the time. And I said, what if these countries got together and they fixed the exchange rates among each other? What do you think other countries would do? And Domingo Cavallo got up and said, well, every country in the world would want to fix to a stable basic currency if there was one. Every country in the world would want to do it. Now, he may be wrong in that. There may be exceptions. It wouldn't take a long period of time. You've got agreement on it. It could be done in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, the same as before. It's not a big problem. There's no big issue. The only big issue is getting over the kind of mistakes you read. This article is riddled with mistakes and misconceptions about what a fixed exchange rate is. Just look at Hong Kong's system of fixed exchange rate. Look at the way that operates. Study the way operations take place between the euro area and within the euro area. Before the euro was created, a lot of economists were very much opposed to it. They said, it's not going to work. Milton Friedman said, it's not going to work. The euro is not going to come into being. First of all, he predicted it's not going to come into being because people would never want it to have. And then after it came into being, he predicted it would break up. But then he acknowledged the fact that he was wrong before about predicting it, so his model may be wrong in the period. But a lot of people thought, how can you have the same interest rate in a country like Ireland, which was growing at 10% a year, and a country like Germany that's only growing at 2% a year? How can you have the same interest rate? The fact is, that's what they do have. They have the same interest rate. The difference is that a rapidly growing country will get more money. The money supply will grow, and does grow in Ireland at 10% a year. In Germany, it goes at 2% a year. Because of the common money that's being put in the pool, it's a competitive thing. Hong Kong, the people in Hong Kong and the island of Hong Kong get exactly the quantity of money that they want. They get what they produce, what they buy. You buy money, you want money, you get it. If the Hong Kong money, the supply of money in Hong Kong is always exactly right, because everybody gets exactly the quantity of money they want to have. If they want more money, they save, and more money comes in. If they want less money, they just save and the money goes out. And they automatically, that's how a well-working fixed exchange rate system operates. You could have that operating as the whole world economy. Just imagine that you have now 13 central banks in the European Union, the monetary union. They all get together and they fix their currencies to each other, and that's the way things work. Imagine those countries are very dissimilar. Greece is very poor compared to Germany and let's say France. Yet they're very dissimilar. But suppose you take three countries, big countries like Europe, United States, and Japan, and you take the three central banks and you ask those three central banks to act as if they're a common money, and you have a common monetary expansion of those three basic areas. And then the other countries fix their currencies relative to it, and it's not a problem. It's not a big problem. It doesn't take 100 years. It doesn't take 1 year. It can be done before the next IMF meeting. I'm not saying it's going to be because people aren't convinced of it. But if, as long as people in countries like Thailand keep saying, oh no, we want flexible exchange rates, we don't want to be part of a monetary system or something like that, we don't want reform, and they just, and then they say, oh no, we like those new multilateral surveillance guidelines because that's the way people are. If they're not thinking independently about this, then it's not going to happen. But there'd be a great benefit, and a benefit, in my opinion, that would be not just the smaller countries who would gain from getting an external anchor, but all the three or four or five big countries, big areas, would gain from it because they wouldn't have to cope with this monetary crisis that we're going through at the present time. Now, what is the end result of this monetary crisis we're going through? What can we predict about? Well, here's what I would predict about it. That since the dollar became the global currency, there's been 6 dollar standards over that period. Each of those different phases of the system has been a new dollar standard. What has happened, the dollar has been strong, the dollar weak, the dollar strong, the dollar weak. Every time there's a big change in it, the system transforms. There's a new form of dollar standard movement, but it's still a dollar standard. At the end of this, we're possibly in what seems to be a little dollar crisis. I think people exaggerate it, but I think there's a little dollar crisis. But at the end result, there'll still be a dollar, we'll still have a dollar standard, it'll still be 70% of the world's currencies are going to be in dollars, and they're still going to be relating their currencies in one way or the other to the dollar. It's still going to be a kind of dollar. But it won't be effective because it won't be so good a thing because of the problems that countries like Thailand have at the present time. In Thailand, in the newspapers today, you see Colombia has a problem with the dollar. You see Korea has a problem with the dollar. Thailand has a problem with the dollar. A whole batch of countries have a problem with the dollar. But this is not a well-working system, and you can reform it, and I don't believe it's a long period you have to wait a long time for. It's just a matter of will. We look at the problems we have in the world of getting any kind of agreement on global warming or on issues that are of great concern. Political problems.
Thank you very much. I understand that there are a lot of questions on the floor. Is it possible that we'll allow 10 participants from the floor who still have questions to sit with Dr. Mundell while he's having lunch? Okay? Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much, Professor Mundell, for your great talk. And the audience is so excited, with this great one. And is it possible that in the near future, we would love to invite you back here again at the University of Thai Chamber of Commerce to give a talk like this? Thank you very much. I have the honor of Associate Professor Dr. Jiradet Usawat to present a token of appreciation to Professor Mundell. Okay, for the last session, on behalf of the organizers, International Peace Foundation, Bridges, and University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I express our sincere thanks for the active participants to the special lecture. And I also wish to extend my gratitude to all of the sponsors of this event, BMW, Visit Hotel, Ogilvy, and Thai Airways. For without their big support, this special speech will not be possible. And last but not least, we wish all participants a safe and sound trip back to your destination, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in the upcoming events in January and February 2008 at the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much. A little announcement, the organizers would like to have a group picture with Professor Mundell and Mr. Uemo Oragan. No, it's possible? Thank you for your audience. Goodbye.